Okay, so last time we left off, we had one slide left. By the way, we had just got through talking about interest rate risk. Can someone tell me the two things that make a bond sensitive to interest rate risk? Two things that make a bond sensitive to interest rate risk.
Time
Uh-huh.
and coupons.
Okay, very good. Let's talk about, is it the long time or the short time that makes them sensitive?
Long.
Yeah, it's long time because these little changes in rates are going to get magnified by a bigger T. And so that's going to make this thing more susceptible to interest rate changes as the time goes out. Now, tell me about these coupons. If you want a bond to be interest rate risky, would you have skinny coupons or fat coupons? If you want it to be risky, you want the skinny coupons, right? So if you thought interest rates were going to go up, you go out and you buy yourself a bunch of skinny coupon bonds. By the way, what's the skinniest coupon you can think of? 0, right? Okay. So now, so those are the two things that we said make bonds riskier from an interest rate perspective, or another word we have for that is price risk. But now let's talk about another kind of risk. It's called reinvestment risk. And that's the risk that these future cash flows that you get, by the way, future cash flows would be the coupons and the future value, the face value, that those will be, you won't be able to reinvest them at the same interest rate, that you have to go lower. By the way, just like interest rate risk, this risk goes both ways, because what if you're getting your coupons and then you're able to reinvest them at a higher rate? So this one cuts both ways also. Now, it's the bond reinvestment risk is just the opposite. The things that make bonds sensitive to this are just the opposite. So, for instance, if I have a short-term bond, so let's assume this. Well, let's say instead of buying a 30-year bond, I'm going to buy 31-year bonds. How often do I have to reinvest that principal? Once per year, right? With the other one, we only have to reinvest once per 30 years. So, short time to maturity increases reinvestment risk. Short time to maturity increases reinvestment risk. And then we also have larger coupons, which is the opposite of interest rate risk. Larger coupons lead to greater risk. And here's why. After 6 months, I'm going to get this big old chunky coupon. What do I need to do with it? Assuming that you're not just spending these coupons on stuff, right? You're going to reinvest it. And if you've got to, so that means once every 6 months that you've got this opportunity to reinvest at a lower rate. And so this is reinvestment risk. If you structure your portfolio to avoid interest rate or price risk, then you are giving yourself a world full of reinvestment risk. And if you structure your portfolio to avoid reinvestment risk, you are giving yourself a world full of price risk or interest rate risk. So there is nowhere to run to. Pick your poison. Which one would you rather have? Questions? Okay. So now we are on to the next set of slides, which are all about bond features. Okay, so first of all, debt is not an ownership claim. You may hear people say, hey man, nice Harley, and the guy says, yeah, the bank owns it. What does he mean? Say again?
He needs to pay his loan money.
Yeah, he's borrowed money from the bank. Now, is he technically correct? No, the bank does not own the motorcycle. He is the owner of the motorcycle. The bank has a claim or lien on the bike. So don't get confused and think that debt is an ownership claim. And we can illustrate this by talking about what shareholders can do versus what debt holders can do. Shareholders make the decisions at the company. They get to vote on stuff. Do bondholders get to vote on anything? No, they're not in charge. And so until they fail to pay the debt, and then at that point, those bondholders can step in. Second thing we need to know is that the companies use of debt gives them some sort of tax shield because the interest is tax deductible. And so if we look at an income statement, we can see that before we figure out our pre-tax, in order to figure out our pre-tax income, we have to subtract interest. And the reason we do that is because interest is tax deductible. Now, can you see that about dividends? Do we see dividends get subtracted out before pre-tax income? Absolutely not. So interest is tax deductible, dividends are not. Unpaid debt is a liability of the firm. What is a liability? A liability is a legal obligation to pay. A liability is a legal obligation to pay. What does that mean? If we don't pay, then the lender can get the courts involved. And they can either force us to pay or they can force us into bankruptcy. If we fail to pay, it gives the lenders the right to take control of the assets through bankruptcy or liquidation. Questions? So let's think back to my motorcycle example. What happens if the cyclist does not pay his car or motorcycle payment? What do? Say again? Yeah, they take it back. It's called repossess. They're going to repossess that bike. They had no rights on that bike until the biker stopped paying the payments, and at that point they can take control of the asset. And it's exactly the same in the corporate world. You can basically take control of the assets if they don't pay. Now, short-term, long-term, we know where the division is in finance and accounting. It's 1 year. So we talk about short-term debt. That's original issue maturity equal to or less than 1 year. And then we've got our long-term debt. By the way, let's talk about this concept of original issue maturity. I've got two different pieces of debt here. One of them is a 30-year bond with 1 year left to maturity. And the other is just a 1 year note. In theory, these things should look an awful lot alike because they're only going to last for a year. And you might say, well, now they're exactly the same, but they're not because their original issue maturities were different. The 1 year note was issued with 1 year to maturity. But what was the original issue maturity of the bond? Oh, come on, I told you it was, 30 years, right? So we talk about the original issue maturity. And we say that notes are greater than a year up to 10 years, and then anything over 10 years is a bond. And so be careful, it's not a matter of a bond when it gets down below 10 years becomes a note. If you're born a bond, you die a bond. You never turn into a note. Questions? The study of finance is complete without death references. Okay. Now let's talk about the bond indenture. An indenture is a contract or an agreement. And so this one is specifically between the borrower and the lender. So how many of you have ever borrowed money from a car lot or a bank or anything like that? Raise your hand. Are you the only? Two. Okay, two. Let's pick on you. I mean, sorry. Let's ask you. When you went to borrow that money, who wrote up the contract? You or the lender?
The lender.
The lender. And your choices were either take the terms they give you or get back on your bicycle and ride home, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, a lot of people think, well, that's the way bonds work, but it's actually the other way around. It's the borrower that writes the terms of the bond contract. And here's why. There is one borrower and many potential lenders. If I, as a borrower, reach out to you folks and say, what kind of things are you looking for in a bond? You're probably all looking for something different. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put together an agreement or contract that I think will be attractive enough to attract enough investors and enough money to be able to get the money that I need to do whatever this thing is that I'm going to do. And so that's why we see the lender being, or the borrower being the one that actually writes the contract, because undoubtedly the lenders could never come to an agreement on this thing. And by the way, the lenders don't even know each other at this point. It's not like there's some group of people that want to lend money and they send me an email saying, hey, we'd really like to loan you some money, here's some terms. It doesn't work that way. Now, what happens if you write your contract to be too much to the advantage of the borrower, which, you know, that would be the temptation, right? What would happen? Would you guys buy my bonds? Absolutely not. And if I write them too loose, I might make my bonds too popular, and I wouldn't be able to get the terms that I wanted. So there's a balancing act here. So there's all this information about the bonds that are in this, and we're going to go through each one of these one at a time. Let's talk about the terms of the bond issue. The most important term is the face value. Now, unless I tell you otherwise, what are you to assume that the face value is? Yeah, it's 1,000. Do you think the lawyers would let me get by with just saying, oh yeah, everybody knows that? No, you got to have it in there. And then there's the coupon rate. Remember, that's the rate that you multiply the face value by to get the coupons. The maturity date. That's the date at which the face value has to be paid. And then finally, the bond form, which is registered versus bearer. Let's talk about these two forms. 95% of bonds today are registered. And in fact, they don't even really exist in paper form. Instead, what happens is they are kept track of electronically, and the borrower has my name, my social security number, my birth date, my address, and they just send me either a check or they make a deposit to my account for the amount of the coupons. If, by the way, is there any bond for me to lose here? No, it's electronic. The only way that could happen is if someone like kicked the plug out on the computer, and I would hope they've got backups, right? And so there's really nothing paper-wise going on here. Now let's talk about bearer bonds. What do you think a bearer bond might be? Think about the ring bearer at a wedding. What does the ring bearer do, other than look cute? They carry the ring. They have the ring in their possession. By the way, never give a 2-year-old an actual ring, right? They swallow it. And you're like 5 days worth of. Yeah, exactly. No. Okay, back to the story. The bearer is the person who has it in their possession. And so what a bearer bond says is that whoever has it in their possession can collect the coupons and can collect the face value when the time comes. They also can sell it to someone. And they can sell it to someone without a record of a transaction. And so, you know, that sounds kind of cool. So, for example, you could use this to cheat on your taxes. A bearer bond. How would you use a bearer bond to cheat on your taxes? So, a registered bond, they've got my social security number, they've got my birthday, they've got my address. Who else do you think they're telling about the bond coupons when they send me one? The IRS. A bearer bond, on the other hand, prior to September of 2001 in the U.S., you could just walk in and get your money, right? You didn't have to, there was no reporting. By the way, September 2001 is the breakover point because we have the Patriot Act, which says, by the way, we don't want big transactions that can go untraced because of what? Any ideas? Yeah, terrorism. That's those guys were really well funded. And they weren't getting really well funded by, you know, like taking up collections on the street. Someone was sending them money, and it was untraceable. Okay, so you can use it to cheat on your taxes. These bonds are still very popular in Europe. Why do you think Europeans like bearer bonds more than Americans do?
You have way higher taxes.
Yeah, they have way higher taxes, and so the ability to cheat on your taxes has a greater value to it. Does that make sense? Now, am I telling you guys to cheat on your taxes? Absolutely not. Okay, no, I'm not. I had a yes on the back row. Okay, now, I will tell you one other thing that you can use these bonds for, and that would be money laundering. So I have a buddy I went to grade school with. He moved out to California, to be part of the rave scene. And then he got this friend who was a drug dealer, feature that, right? Part of the rave scene. Well, anyway, so back to the story. This guy's big thing was marijuana, and he sold tons and tons of marijuana. This is before it was legal in any way, shape, or form. Tons and tons of marijuana, and he had a goal. When he had $320,000, he was going to retire. Keep in mind, this is more than 20 years ago. When he had $320,000 in cash, he was going to retire. Now, where do you think drug dealers keep their money? Can they keep it? Yeah, it's in physical form, right? So this guy actually had his stuff buried in coolers in the backyard. So he would vacuum bag it, and then he would put it in the cooler. By the way, why do you vacuum bag it? Yeah, you're trying to keep out oxygen and water and all that, right? Then he puts it in the cooler for like double protection. So he has this whole yard full of coolers by the time he retires. Okay, now his grand plan is to go retire in Mexico because two things. Number one, law enforcement's kind of lax, and number two, you can buy citizenship in Mexico for cash. This is a little known secret. I actually knew someone that bought Mexican citizenship for $100,000. It's in theory not something you can do, but with enough money you can, right? Okay, so what happens? How does this guy manage to get his $320,000 into Mexico? Can he like pull his cooler train across the border at Tijuana? No. So what does he do? He goes out and buys a bunch of bearer bonds. And when he's going through immigration, and he opens up and they say, well, what are this? He's like, well, this is my collection of engravings. Aren't they pretty? Because all these bonds usually have some sort of picture on them. There's usually some sort of half-naked woman involved. I don't know why. But, he's basically able to just, and he probably, tips the guy on the way through, right? That probably helps grease the wheels too. But he doesn't have to go through there with a train full of coolers full of cash. Then he gets down to Mexico, and what can he do? Well, he can cash in enough of his bonds in order to buy his citizenship. And then he can either sell, and by cash in I mean sell, or he could sell he could hold on to the bonds and collect the coupons, or he could sell the bonds and get the cash. Now, let's talk about why it would be dangerous for him to hold on to the bonds and try to collect the coupons. What are the dangers of having a physical document that allows you to collect money without any sort of identification? Yeah, someone could steal it, or there might be a fire. These are both things that happen in Mexico, happen here, right? And so the bearer bonds are not a good thing for him long term. So what's he going to do? He's probably going to take that money and put it into different banks, right? At small enough amounts that it doesn't raise any alarms. Does that make sense? Now, am I teaching you how to launder money? Yes. Should you be doing it?
Yes.
No. No, absolutely not. Folks, just go out there and make your fortune legitimately, and that way you never have to look over your shoulder. You remember my buddy that went to federal prison for 7 years? He says he was so glad he got caught because the pressure of maintaining this lie for years on end was about to kill him. He was like 2 donuts away from having a heart attack, and he smoked like a chimney. And he said, I was so glad that they caught me. Okay, so don't break the law. Sounds fun, but it's not. Okay, let's talk about security. Security is what we can take if the borrower doesn't pay. Security is what we can take if the borrower doesn't pay. What's the security for a car loan? The car. What's the security for a house loan? The house. Okay, now that we've got that nailed down, we're going to talk about this word collateral. Now, collateral we tend to use for the house in the house loan or the car in the car loan. But with bonds, it has a more specific definition. And that is, it is a collection of securities that can be taken if they don't pay. So it's not just any sort of collateral, you know, car, house, whatever. It's a collection of securities. Now, what kinds of securities are we talking about? Well, it's going to be a debt security that is more safe than the company's bonds. So, for example, it could be some treasury notes, some treasury bonds that they had on hand that they didn't want to sell, they want to hold on to them, but they can offer them as security for the loan. That's collateral. Now let's ask this. What do you think? No, we'll get that in a minute, sorry. Okay, so let's talk about mortgage securities. If I say I have a mortgage loan, what have I borrowed money to buy? Oh, come on, you guys know? A house, very good. If I borrow money to buy a house, we call that a mortgage. And a mortgage security, turns out, it's a bond that is backed by property or equipment. It's backed by property or equipment. And so it could be a factory, it could be an electrical plant, could be an office building in San Antonio, could be any of these things. You could back with mortgage or use as security for mortgage securities. And then there are debentures. Now, if you are in the U.S., a debenture is an unsecured piece of debt. In other words, if they don't pay the debenture, there isn't something that you can take. And so it would be unsecured debt. So this is like what we would call a signature loan here in the U.S. All that is backing it is your signature and then just any assets that happen to be left over after everybody else takes the stuff that is granted as, or that is called out as security to other loans. Now let's ask this question. Do you think, which do you think would have a higher yield to maturity? A debenture or a mortgage security? Yeah, a debenture has to be because it is riskier to the lender. Does that make sense? It's riskier to the lender. It has to have a higher yield to maturity. So these debentures are going to have higher yields to maturity. Then we have another, we talked about notes earlier. Something we didn't tell you about them is that they are unsecured. They are unsecured. The debt of the United States government, is it secured or unsecured?
Unsecured?
Unsecured, absolutely. So think about this. The Chinese have loaned us a bunch of money. If we decide to say, hey, sorry, we're not going to pay you guys, can they take California? No, I'd give it to them, but they can't take it, right? They can't take it. That would be, the debt would be secure. So it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is just like the idea of the signature loan. It's just like the idea of the debenture here. Okay, questions? Okay. Now let's talk about seniority. How many of you have ever had a job where seniority mattered? So what did you do?
I mean, I was just the intern, but
You were the intern. Where were you at on the whole seniority pecking order?
near the bottom.
Near the bottom? I bet you were the bottom. Okay, seniority. How long you been on the job? By the way, you guys might not have ever guessed, but I was actually a union member at one point. And it was at a grocery store. And you can't have all of the grocery sackers go on break at the same time, because then the old ladies would have no one to complain about, right? And so we had to take turns taking breaks. And the most senior person got to take their break first. And it also gave us the ability to name vacation weeks. Of course, there are some weeks that are more popular than others. I always ended up getting something like mid-August or something really crappy because I was low on the seniority list. There is seniority, it turns out, and in the bond market too. So you're going to have, and it's basically all about the order of payment. The senior bonds are going to get paid first, then the junior bonds, and then some bonds we haven't talked about yet, subordinated bonds. So let's talk about, just conceptually about this. This isn't accurate in the real world, but it helps you get an idea of how this is set up. Let's assume that you go out and you loan a bunch of money, or you borrow a bunch of money as a company. And then down the road, you're having to expand, you need to borrow some more money. Would you, as one of those original bondholders, be pleased to know that this company is going to go out and borrow some more money? No, why not?
Because you won't get paid back, and if they're going to buy more money, there's a less likely chance you're going to get paid.
Yeah, and if we're all getting the same kind of bond, now we're all in line together. So instead, what the company could do is issue now junior debt. What does a junior debt mean? It means the senior debt holders are still going to get paid first, but the junior debt holders stand right behind them in line. Now, what do you think the yield to maturity has to be on the junior debt compared to the senior debt? It's got to be higher because it's riskier, because we know they have to pay off the senior debt holders before they get to us. Now, let's assume that there is another layer, so there's another bond issue, and now they go out and issue something called subordinated debt. And the subordinated debt is behind both the senior and junior debt. So what does the yield to maturity for subordinated debt look like versus junior debt? It's got to be higher, right? It's got to be higher. And so if you want some really, really risky debt, subordinated, unsecured, that'd be the way to go. Now, why in the world would you want some really, really risky debt? What did we just get through saying about the yield to maturity on these things? Got to be high. Now, if you only buy one company's subordinated, unsecured debt, you've got to be high, right? Because if they don't pay, you're wiped out. So, what did we learn about portfolios? Should you buy only the bonds of one company? No, buy them all. Does that make sense? Okay, questions? Yeah?
So does it mean if we buy subordinated bonds together, like buy all of them, are we gonna be better?
Oh yeah, so if I go around and buy subordinated bonds from a bunch of different companies, I am so much better than taking that same money and only buying the subordinated bonds of one. I'll give you a similar example. We're going to talk about junk bonds. Junk bonds are risky, they have a high yield to maturity, but 95–96% of the time they pay off. But how do I know which 95% are going to pay off and which 5% are going down the toilet? Do I know? If you do know, come to my office. We'll get rich together.
Have you bought all of those?
So now that you buy all of these, what happens? You're going to lose money on a few of them, but the yield to maturity on the rest is going to be so high, it'll make up for it. Does that make
Have you done
sense?
that before?
Have I done that before? Absolutely not. I only buy equities, right? Maybe when I'm an older man. How about that? I have never, no, I shouldn't say that. I've bought bonds a couple of times in my life, and it was through the federal government's little website. Total pain in the butt. You guys asked about I-bonds the other day, and it sounds like a neat thing. Just go try to make their 1996 website work. Right? It sucks. Questions? Okay. So let's talk about repayment. If there is no agreement to repay principal, then all the principal gets paid at the end. But the way bonds are structured, I can't repay principal along the way. By the way, this is one of the things you hear these personal finance gurus say is, you should pay down extra principal on your mortgage. And that way you'll get done paying sooner. And it's true, it does work. But the way bonds are structured, you can't do that because bonds have these interest-only payments and then all the principal is due at the end. So if I wanted to pay off 10% of the outstanding principal for a bond issue, it's not that I go around and give $100 to every single person who holds a bond. Instead, what do? I go out and I buy back 10% of the bonds. I go back and buy 10% of the so I purchase them. That's the only way we're going to be able to pay down the principal on this bond issue early, is by buying these bonds back. Now, if they're traded on the open market, and by the way, a lot of bonds are traded out there just like stocks, you can just go out into the market and buy them. No one even knows or cares. If you don't, then you have to have what's called a call option or a call bond, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And basically that allows the borrower to force you to sell the bond back. So where does the money come from to do these repurchases? It comes from something called a sinking fund. Now, why is it called a sinking fund? When we issue new bonds, we are said that we are floating a debt issuance. We are floating some new bonds. What's the opposite of floating? Sinking. And so if I'm going to pay off those bonds, then I'm going to sink the issue, and the fund that I'm going to use that is the sinking fund. Now, where does the money come from in the sinking fund? The borrower periodically puts money into the sinking fund in order to buy these bonds back. And that's actually in the contract. I have to put aside so much money at each time to buy back these bonds. I put it into the sinking fund, and then someone called the bond trustee, which is a third party. The bond trustee uses the money in the sinking fund to go out there and buy back the bonds. Now, what would be riskier? A bond with a sinking fund provision or one without? Yeah, without. Why? It's got to be riskier. Okay, let's think about this. You got a 10-year bond, and each year you're buying down 10%. At the very end, all you've got left is 10% of the bond left to pay off. So roughly, basically $100 per bond that you originally started with. Does that make sense? So let's say you borrowed $100,000 at the beginning. Now you only owe $10,000. What's more likely to get paid off, $100,000 or $10,000? Yeah, $10,000. So I have this cousin, Harry, minor criminal, and he bought this house up in Kansas City, and I went up to visit him, and I'm like, dude, this is a nice house. I said, how can you afford this? And he says, I've got this great mortgage. I said, tell me about your mortgage. He said, well, my payments are really, really small. He says, but then at 15 years, there's this thing called a balloon payment that comes due. I said, what are you going to do then? He's like, oh, I'll probably refinance it. His balloon payment comes due during the financial crisis. Do you think anybody wants to refinance his? No! The next thing I know, he's headed for the border in a trailer, right? Because he's got no house. And well, anyway, back to the story. If he had a mortgage like mine, I've got a 30-year fixed mortgage. Is there going to be a balloon anywhere along in my? No, I'm much more likely to be able to make all those payments than Harry ever was. Harry used to have a mustache, made him look like Hitler. Very freaky. Scary, scary. Okay, back to the story. So we talked about the open market or called, and we talked about why it reduces the risk. Any questions? Okay, now I mentioned that in order to be able to call a bond or to force the lender to sell you the bond back, you have to have what's called a call provision. And a call provision is basically like an option. Are you guys familiar with options? Call options, put options? A call option gives you the right but not the obligation to do something in the future at a pre-agreed upon price. So a callable bond gives the borrower the right but not the obligation to repurchase the bonds at a set price in the future. So let's talk about how that would happen. There has to be something called a call premium, which is what they would pay in order to be able to call this bond back from you. In other words, if they sell it to you for $1,000 because it's a par bond, and then the time goes along and they want to buy it back, they have to pay you face value plus this call premium. The call premium is usually 1 year's worth of coupons or one coupon payment. And so let's say that it was $40, so you'd have to pay these people $1,040 in order to be able to call their bonds back. Let's talk about when bond prices go up. We said if the interest rate goes down, bond prices go up. So let's assume interest rates have been going down, bond prices have been going up, and now these bonds are trading for $1,057. Is it worth it to me as the borrower to exercise my call option? Here I am, able to buy something that is selling for $1,057, and I can buy it for $1,040. Does that sound like a good deal? Absolutely. And so I'm going to exercise that call option. Now, the lender, or the borrowers, are going to get a check for $1,040 for every bond that they had. Are they happy?
Well, if they don't know about the thing, they are.
Say again?
If they don't know about the interest rate going down and their present value being up, they are.
Yeah, because otherwise, let's assume that they don't want to take this money out and buy a Maserati or whatever. What are they going to need to do with that money? They're going to have to reinvest it. Well, now they go out and they look for new bonds, and what do they find out about the rates that are being offered by new bonds? They're lower. Does that make sense? Okay, so we know then that this is riskier for the bondholder if there is this call option. They have reinvestment risk that they need to be protected against. So what are they going to do? Are they going to demand a higher or lower yield to maturity? Yeah, higher yield to maturity. Okay, so I will tell you a quick example that was in the Wall Street Journal. It's been more than 20 years ago. It's when I was in MBA school. There were these little old ladies, and they and their husbands had retired to Florida. And they had bought a bunch of bonds back in the early 80s when interest rates were high. So these had big, juicy coupons in them, let's say 12%. And then the time comes around, the bonds mature, and the little old ladies go down to the broker and say, we need to reinvest this money. And the broker says, no problem. I have bonds that are of similar risk and whatnot. He says the coupon is 6%. What do you think the little old ladies think at this point? Like, oh, that's a 50% cut in my bond income. And they say, well, don't you have anything that pays a little more? And the bond broker says, well, I do have these bonds here. They're from the same company, and they pay 6.25%. But you should be very careful to read the entire prospectus before you borrow or before you lend them your money. And they say 6.25 is better than 6, so they put their money in. 2 years later, interest rates go down again, and the little old ladies get a check in the mail along with a letter. This says, your bonds have been called, here's your money, have a nice life. And so the little old ladies jump in the Buick, because you know it's a Buick, right? They jump in the Buick and they head down to the broker's office, and they're livid. And they say, wait a minute, how did this happen? He says, well, do you remember when I said that this one's similar, but you need to read the difference in the paperwork? Well, that extra 0.25% was a compensation for taking on this reinvestment risk. And so now the little old ladies are out there having to reinvest at something less than 6%. Does that make sense? And this was the truly heartbreaking part. A little old lady said, it's terrible. My income is way down. I can only afford to eat at the country club once per week. Isn't that awful? Yeah. Okay, so there is your cautionary tale about call provisions in bonds. Any questions? Now let's talk about protective covenants. A covenant is an agreement. And so these are agreements, and they are meant to protect the bond holders. They are meant to protect the bond holders. And you say, wait a minute, the borrower is the one that's putting this thing together. Why in the world would they do stuff to protect the bond holders? Any ideas?
So they don't take advantage of them.
Okay, so if I am certifying that that I'm not going to take advantage of you, what do you do in return that's a benefit to me?
Agree to the terms.
You agree to the terms and say again?
This is about the rates.
Yeah, it's about the rate. If I'm promising not to do all sorts of dirty stuff that would put you at risk, aren't you going to require a lower return on that bond? Absolutely, it's less risky. So what kinds of things do I want to promise? Well, I want to promise not to do things that I don't intend to do anyway, right? Now we put it in writing. Now you can reward me for getting rid of that risk, and I didn't plan to do it anyway. So those are the sorts of things we want to put in there because it lowers our cost of borrowing. But we have to be careful. You say, well, wait a minute, we could just throw a bunch of these things in there and borrow for really, really cheap. Yes, but at some point you get your hands tied and you can't do anything. You have no flexibility because of all these covenants. So you have to be careful. The covenants that we go through, you can think of it as being cafeteria. Do you guys know about cafeteria? When I was in a dorm, it wasn't nearly as nice as what you guys had. We had like army style where they just like slop the stuff on your tray as you go by and they hurl insults at you. They may still do that, I don't know. But you could say, no, I don't want the chicken tetrazzini because you knew it was going to give you diarrhea, right? So, but you could choose what you didn't want. And so that's the same thing we've got going on here. You can choose the things that you do want and the things that you don't want. And so we want to be careful about which ones we choose. Now, negative covenants are ones that tell us things that we cannot do. Positive covenants tell us what we must do. So you can think of these in terms of thou shalt not and thou shalt. Those are thou shalt not's the negative. So, here are some examples of negative covenants. There are other negative covenants out there. Not all of these will show up in every bond issue. First of all, the firm must limit dividend payments. Who receives dividend payments? Shareholders, bondholders? Shareholders. This is a shareholder thing. Why would I even care as a bondholder? By the way, the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. What if I went out and raised a bunch of debt? I'm going to borrow a bunch of money from you folks. And you pay me that money, and I'm happy, and I say thank you. And then I come over here to my shareholders, and I pay all that money out as a big old dividend. And then I declare bankruptcy. Are you guys happy? No. Are you ever going to get that money back? No. And so this is one, this is the biggest extreme example of why we want this in the covenant. On a lower order of scumbaggery, what about people paying dividends that are so high that it puts at risk the payment of the coupon? It puts at risk the payment of the principal. This is why we don't want them to pay extraordinary dividends, because they need cash on hand to pay the coupons and to eventually redeem or pay off the bonds. Now, how are we going to limit them? We're probably going to say you can only pay out 40% of your earnings per share as dividends. And that way, if they're not making money, they're not paying out any dividends. Does that make sense? Can't pledge assets to other lenders. So, I'm going to give you an example. I come to Mr. Jaquez. I say, Mr. Jaquez, I've got this house. It's worth $400,000, and I totally own this house. Will you loan me $250,000 against this house? Yeah, he will. Okay, and then I come to Ms. Robinson. You obviously haven't heard this conversation. And I say, I've got this $400,000 house. Would you loan me $250,000 against it? Yeah, she says yes, and she's smart, because it sounds right. I do the same thing over here to Mr. Umfleet, and he says yes. Okay, now I have borrowed $750,000 against a $400,000 house. as long as I keep up my payments to all of these people, nobody's the wiser, everybody's happy. Do you think that's how these stories typically end? No. These stories typically end with, as soon as I get the money, what do? Phew, slip town, right? So it takes a little bit for these three to figure it out, but Mr. Jaquez is the first one on the scene. He knocks on the door and he's yelling, "Give me my money." And then, of course, I'm not there, and so he says, "I'm going to repossess the house." And just then, Ms. Robinson walks up. And she says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm here to repossess my house." And she says, "Wait a minute, Jack." She doesn't know his name. "Wait a minute, Jack." She says, "That's my house." And right about this time, Mr. Oomfleet's coming up the sidewalk. And he's like, "Wait a minute." And he figures out what's going on. He's like, "No, this is my house." And so a three-way fist fight breaks out. That's what this looks like, right? Three-way fist fight breaks out between these three. How can we avoid that kind of situation? We need to have covenants that say we can't pledge those assets to other lenders. Does that make sense? Because then we won't all be fighting over them at the end. Firm cannot merge with another firm. This one would be relatively rare, and here's why. Lots of firms merge with other firms all the time. Think about Facebook. The only thing that's about Facebook that's worth a damn is Instagram. How did they get their hands on that? They bought it. And you might use WhatsApp. I think Facebook bought it too. So Facebook could not say, "We're not going to merge with other companies." But let's assume that merging wasn't part of your business model. You could actually say that you're not going to do that. Now let's talk about why people might not want you to merge with other firms. Let's assume that my brother-in-law and I are both businessmen. I have a dairy. A dairy is where you get milk from cattle. And I have a contract with the Springfield Public School District for basically cost plus 10%. So I'm guaranteed a profit. And kids love milk, right? So I've got this great contract to supply milk to the Springfield School District. I need to borrow money to put in a new chocolate milk line. And so I throw out some bonds, and you guys say, "Wow, it's safe. He's got a guaranteed string of income, so we're going to let him do it for 4." What's that?
Your cameras.
Oh, thanks. It's looking at me now. I think maybe just the force of your disapproval forced it to spin around. Okay. So let's see if it follows me over here. Okay. So you guys say 4% yield to maturity. You guys are thrilled with that. And my brother-in-law, he has a company that does radioactive waste cleanup. And so, after these nuclear incidents like we had in 3 Mile in New York, in Ukraine, and then also in Japan, he goes in and cleans up after that kind of stuff. He went out and needed to borrow some money for some cleanup equipment. And his business is so risky. Do you think his lenders were only going to demand 4%? No, they're going to demand 8%. And so everybody's happy because that's what the risk of those bonds requires. Now, my brother-in-law and I are sitting over Thanksgiving dinner, and we're like, "Hey, it'd be a great idea if we merged our firms." And so after we merged the firm is an average riskiness between these two things, the safe thing and the risky thing. And so now those bonds that he had issued for the nuclear waste equipment, instead of yielding 8%, they're only yielding 6% because now they are less risky. As that required rate drops, what happens to the price of his bonds? Yeah, they go up. Are you guys happy? You don't like more money? I like more money, right? So as the bond goes up, you guys are happy. But these bondholders over here that I sold these bonds to at 4%, now they're yielding 6%. What just happened to the price of their bonds? Yeah, they went down because the required rate of return went up for them. Does that make sense? And so this is a straight up wealth transfer from the safe bondholders to the risky bondholders when a safe and a risky company merge. Straight up wealth transfer. Wealth transfers are great as long as you're the one getting the money. They suck if you're the one paying the money. And so one of the things that I can do, especially if I'm a safe firm, is say we're not going to merge with another firm. Does that make sense? Okay. Can't sell or lease major assets without lender approval. So let's assume that it's unsecured debt. What is backing that debt? The assets of the firm. So basically, anything that the firm has that's not already securitized in one of these instruments, like a mortgage bond or one of these other secured ones, then that can be sold to satisfy this debt. And so if my debt is only backed by the assets of the firm, the general assets of the firm, I want to make sure that they're not going to go out, sell off those assets, and then just give that money as like a big old dividend to the shareholders, because that's entirely possible. And in fact, we know that Sears, are you guys familiar with Sears? Sears was a department store. When I was a kid, it was the coolest place on earth. And by the end of its dying, gasping days, it sucked, right? Now, what did they do toward the end to try to stay alive? They started selling off assets. They started selling off real estate. They started selling off different brands like Craftsman, Kenmore, whatnot, trying to get enough money to stay in business. If you were a bondholder at Sears, you would have much rather them go into bankruptcy a long, long time ago, keep those assets intact. Therefore, when the assets got liquidated, you would get more money instead of the diddly squat that they ended up getting. Does that make sense? Okay. And then cannot issue additional long-term debt. This one would be rarely used. But we talked about earlier, if you had loaned someone money, you would not want them to go out and borrow additional long-term debt from someone else, because that reduces the probability that you'll get paid back. Therefore, it's increasing the risk of that debt. You'll need a higher yield to maturity. But guess what? You locked in your coupon rate when you loaned that money. And so now when yield to maturity goes up on those bonds, the price goes down and you have a loss. Questions? Okay. Now let's talk about positive covenants. What does NWC stand for? Networking capital. What's the formula for networking capital? Current assets minus current liabilities. Thank you. Okay, current assets, things we expect to produce cash within a year. Current liabilities, things we expect to consume cash within a year. We want that, of course, to be positive, because after all, cash is how these coupons are going to get paid. And so we're telling the firm they have to maintain net working capital at or above a stated minimum level. And that makes a lot of sense. But how do we know? How do we know what they're doing? Well, we have to have them periodically furnish audited financial statements to the bondholders. First of all, the financial statements tell us, hopefully, what the net working capital is. We can look at them and figure that out. Why do you think we need to have them be audited? I'll get you started. People are scumbags. Do you think people will lie for money?
All the time.
All the time. Do you think people will lie for chocolate? Do you think people will lie for sex? People will lie for damn near anything they find of value, right? And so, how do I try to limit the ability for the borrower to lie? I get someone else to look at the books, right? Now, what does the auditor do? They come in and by the way, this is typically an accounting firm, right? They come in and they look at the transactions. Do they look at all of them? No, they look at a random sampling of transactions, and they try to see if they see any systematic problems or systemic problems in what's going on at the firm. Now, if they spot a problem, typically the response is that they just withdraw as the auditor. Typically will not say, woohoo, look at this. These people are lying, cheating bastards. Why would they not want to do that? would you hire an accounting firm that had called one of their clients lying, cheating bastards? No. I would hire one that had withdrawn from being an auditor, right? Okay, so there's an incentive not to make the client too mad. I'll give you an example here of why auditing doesn't always work. The year is 1998. It's late 97, very end of the year. I'm in Dallas, Texas, and I see our auditor at the time was Arthur Andersen, which is the same company that was doing Enron's books. Same office and everything. And so Arthur Andersen came in to do our books. And I am down on the shop floor. I'm a 25-year-old shop foreman, basically. And I see this guy who looks even younger than I do, and he's dressed up in a very nice suit and these very shiny shoes. And I figured he must be one of these Arthur Andersen guys. And sure enough, a guy from the warehouse runs up to him and says, "Are you the accountant?" And he says, "Why, yes, I am," right? Because I think the tie was brand new. He was a brand new accountant. And they say to him, or the warehouseman says, "Would you be interested to know that these people have a bunch of inventory out on the back dock that they haven't brought in to the inventory system yet?" What do you think the accountant said? "Oh, yeah. By the way that our guys got paid typically was through bonuses based on some accounting numbers. And one of those accounting numbers was inventory turns. And if you have a smaller inventory, your inventory turns look better. So what do? At the end of the year, we would go through this exercise called draining the swamp, where we get the inventory down just as low as we possibly could. And then they would let stuff build up on the back dock. And then on January 1st, we'd have a big party, or January 2nd actually, have a big party where we started receiving all this stuff into inventory. Okay. The Arthur Andersen accountant pulls out his little disposable wind-up camera, because we didn't have phones like that back then, right? You had to snap the pictures. He's taking all sorts of pictures of this inventory. And then he steps out on the shop floor and he starts making some phone calls with his huge wireless phone, right? Because this is 1997, it's huge. He's making these calls, and I could hear part of what he's doing. What he's doing is calling these other Arthur Andersen people at our other locations and asking them to go check out the back dock. And everywhere he calls, there is a boatload of inventory sitting out on the dock. Is this a systemic problem for the company? Yeah, it's going on everywhere. It's not just a simple mistake. It's going on everywhere. So the junior accountant goes to the site manager for and this is where I lose track of him, but I know what happened beyond here fairly well. He goes to the site guy and says, "We've got this problem." He tells him about all the inventory on the back dock. And the first thing that the site guy says is, "Oh, I'm sure that's not material," meaning it doesn't matter, because, this is just one location out of many for this company. He says, "I knew you'd say that, so I called their facilities in Duncan, Oklahoma, Houston, Texas, Montrose, Scotland, and we had one in Saudi Arabia, all sorts of places." He says, "It's the same everywhere. Everywhere. They've got inventory sitting on the dock." And so, of course, the site manager says, "Okay, well, I will report this to the managing partner in Houston." He calls the managing partner in Houston. The managing partner in Houston goes in to meet with the audit committee, and they say, "How's the audit going?" And he says, "Fine, except for we did have this one tiny little problem." And then he mentions the millions and millions of dollars of inventory which have not been properly brought into the system, obviously to keep inventory numbers low artificially. And here's what happens next, I think. They say to him, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. This is very important. By the way, we were thinking about hiring a new auditor. Do you have any suggestions?" Do you catch what just happened there? This is a hot piece of information. Think very carefully what you do with it, because if you do what you're talking about doing, what are we going to do? Get a different auditor. Does that make sense? Okay. Do you think it showed up in the audit report? No. Had it been a different auditor, it might have, because this is the same Arthur Anderson that like 4 years later implodes because they were fudging the books at Enron. Okay, so are audited financial statements a guarantee that the information is truthful? No. Are they better than non-audited financial statements? Absolutely. Are non-audited financial statements better than no financial statements? Yes. Does that make sense? So I talked to a guy here in town that is a business broker. He helps people buy and sell businesses. And people always bring him their accounting numbers. And he says, I don't want to see your accounting numbers. He says, I want to see your tax returns. Why do you think he wants to see the tax returns instead of the accounting numbers? Yeah, who are you going to lie to more? Do you think you might be tempted to fudge up some accounting numbers to make your company look good? Sure. Is the risk higher when you lie to the government? Yeah. The other thing people like to do is cheat on their taxes. And so if truly these accounting numbers are really good and the tax bill is really low, what does that mean? It means they've been cheating on their taxes. And he would say to these people, they would be like at the age to retire and they want to sell the business. And he would say, you need to take a year or two and get yourself cleaned up. What does he mean by cleaned up? Get yourself to the point that your accounting numbers match what you're telling the government. And at that point, we can talk. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the firm must maintain any collateral or security in good condition. You loan someone money to buy a car. Do you want them to take care of it? Yeah, why?
Take that if they don't pay.
Yeah, if they don't pay, I'm going to have to take that thing, and I don't want that 78 Camaro. I want to be able to sell it on. The better the shape it is, the more likely I am to be able to get my money back. So that's why I want to say you've got to take care of this stuff. Questions? So let's talk about bond ratings. They're supposed to be a combination of default risk and the probability of recovery given default. I believe your book only says default risk, but that is not true. So you could have, if it were just default risk, you could have two bonds from the same company, otherwise identical. One could be secured and one could not be secured, and they would both have the same bond rating because the default risk is the same. But the risk of recovery, if default occurs, is much greater on the secured bond because there's something you can grab to try to get your money back. And so that's why we say that they're actually a mixture of default risk and probability of recovery given default. What this leads to is that we can actually have different bond ratings for the different bonds of the firm because they have different indentures and they have different security behind them. So who is it that comes up with these ratings? Well, there are actually three big ones, actually two big ones and a medium one. S&P and Moody's, the big ones. Fitch is a little less, but those are the ones that are doing this. And what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to be looking at these firms and determining their financial strength. And the stronger they are, the more willing they are, or the more likely they are to pay off their debt, and the higher the bond rating will be. Plus, you're going to look at things like, what do you get if they don't pay? Okay, now, here's the problem. If you're a big company, they're all going to rate your bonds regardless. And so you're getting the bond rating for free. But what if you're a small company? Then people actually pay to have their bonds rated. I'll give you an example. Are you guys familiar with city utilities here in Springfield? My friend Janet was the director of treasury for city utilities, and she went out to raise money to build a new power plant over on the southwest side of town. And so she was talking to the investment banker, which is someone that helps you raise money. And he said, you know, what you should really do is get these bonds rated. Now, is city utilities large enough for these people to automatically rate their bonds? Of course not. But it might serve helpful for them to pay to have their bonds rated, and here's why. City utilities, we know, if we live here, we know that they're really financially solid. we know not to be concerned about loaning them money. Do you think someone in Chicago is just as aware of the financial strength of city utilities? What about someone in New York City? Even less likely. And so what comes down to is if you want your bonds to be purchasable by a larger audience, then you want to have them rated. Now it's going to cost you some money, but on the flip side, if I've got a bigger audience buying my bonds, hopefully the required return will be lower because there's going to be more demand for my bonds. That drives up the price, drives down the required return. Okay, so they go ahead and decide to do that, and she gets S&P to rate the bonds, and it all works out well. But let me show you where the conflict of interest shows up here. Mr. Jaquez is S&P, Ms. Robinson is Moody's, and Mr. Unfleet is Fitch. Aren't you lucky, Fitch? Okay. Fitch, it just sounds bad, doesn't it? Okay, so I come to S&P and I say, check out these bonds. How much, what would you rate these bonds? Let's just go simple, good or bad? Good. Oh, very good. He knows how to play this game. How much will you charge me to do that?
I did.
Think big. You're a capitalist.
100,000.
He's going to charge me $100,000. Now, you did not hear him. I go to Moody's and I say, good or bad?
Good.
Good. And what? How much are you going to charge me?
150.
150. She obviously is playing along with this didn't hear him thing, right? Then I go to Fitch. Good or bad?
Good.
Good. See, he was trying to make it sound like he was on the bubble there to seem legitimate, right? How much?
We'll go right in the middle, 125.
125. Okay, so now all of these people have told me that I'm going to get a good rating. He's the cheapest of them all. Who do I go with? I go with him. Now, what if Fitch over here had said, ooh, bad, but he was only going to charge me $50,000?
Still.
Yeah, I still got to go down here. There is a perverse incentive for these bond rating firms to issue nice bond ratings. And I'll give you a real world example. You guys hopefully are old enough to remember the mortgage bust, right? Those mortgages were getting packaged into these securities, and the securities were then getting rated by S&P. And S&P and Moody's and Fitch, they just kept slapping these AAA ratings on them, which is like top of the line, baby. After the financial crisis is over, and by the way, most of those bonds, pretty worthless, right? After the financial crisis is over, they pull these three groups in, Capitol Hill investigation, and they say, what led you to give these ratings? And they said, well, we really didn't know how to figure out what the true risk of those bonds were, so we just slapped a AAA on them. If you truly don't know what the risk of something is, you should either A, say so, or B, slap the lowest rating on them, right? But no, that's not how you make money. So they all three confess to their guilt. The United States government only chooses to go after S&P. Now, let me tell you one more thing about S&P. S&P had recently downgraded the United States government from its AAA debt rating, yet Moody's and Fitch did not. Yeah, people are scumbags. Okay. Now, we know now that rated bonds, you can't trust the ratings, but like audited financial statements, a rated bond is better than an unrated bond. Does that make sense? Okay, so we've got these ratings tiers. And at the top are investment grade, and we'll look at a picture here in a minute on what that is. At the top are investment grade. These are the ones that can be purchased by anybody. Charities, university endowments, pension funds, they can all invest in these investment grade bonds. And so the audience for these things are much larger than they are for junk bonds, because those people who are made to only invest in investment grade bonds can't buy junk bonds. Now, junk sounds so negative. Let's talk about a way to get around that. Who are my marketing people here? Mr. Fisher, I come to you and I say, I got these bonds, and they are so risky. And he's like, well, what are you calling these things? I'm like, they're called junk bonds. Marketing guy, is that a good name for us to slap on these bonds? No. He says, tell me more about these bonds. I say, these things are so risky, they require an extraordinarily high yield. And Mr. Fisher says, aha, I'm onto something. Instead of calling them junk bonds, we'll call them high yield bonds. Doesn't that sound better? Yeah! And so there's high yield bonds, another name for this. Now, let's talk about where junk bonds used to come from. In the old times, before the 1980s, all bonds were born as investment grade, and then over their lifetimes, if they fell upon hard times, they would become what are known as fallen angels. Fallen angels. Now, what does that mean? It means they started out as investment grade, but the company got risky, and so the bonds fell into that junk category. But then someone in the 1980s came along, a guy named Michael Milken. And Michael Milken says, wait a minute. I love these junk bonds. I can sell them all day long, but there just aren't enough of them. So, sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. He says, instead of waiting for these other bonds to become fallen angels, why don't we get some riskier companies to issue junk bonds from the beginning? So these are original issue junk. Original issue junk. And so now the junk bond market explodes. And in the 1980s, we saw the results of that you had lots of mergers and acquisitions that were funded with these junk bonds. And once again, 95-96% of these things are going to pay off. And so you're going to get that high yield maturity on those. And as long as you're holding a diversified portfolio, those ones that do pay off will cover the ones that don't. Okay, here we go with our pretty picture. Anything in green or blue is considered investment grade. Anything in green or blue is considered investment grade. Anything in yellow or red is considered junk. Okay, so we're comparing Moody's and S&P, and there is quite a lot of agreement that these things do compare. So big A from S&P is the same as big A, little a from Moody's. Big A from S&P is the same as big A from Moody's, and so forth. By the way, each one of these are like grades for our undergrads, pluses and minuses, right? So you could have a double A plus, which is what the United States government was at when they got all mad at S&P. You could have an A minus and so forth. Then we have down below, we've got, and by the way, anybody can buy those top ones, the blue and the green, because they're all investment grade. But as soon as you drop into that junk category, now the audience is much smaller for these bonds. And we see everything matches up until we end up at the end for S&P, they have a class D. D stands for default. What do you think that means? These bonds are already in default. Would you buy a bond that's already in default? I'm going to tell you next time about something called vulture capitalism. If you want to buy a healthy company, buy the stock. If you want to take control of a sick company, buy the debt and then wait for it to die. Why? Because when they default on that debt, you'll be able to take control of the assets. And I'll give you some examples on when that's really good to do. Questions?